We are, the South Wales Equality Group is a local group affiliated to the Equality Trust. You may be aware of their work. We have a couple of leaflets here if you'd like to pick them up. The Equality Trust is specifically, well, it's a charity, and it's specifically devoted to raising awareness about the effects of income and wealth inequality. So not all the kinds of inequality that there are in the world. There are many other kinds too, and most of them are pretty bad in their different ways. What the Equality Trust is specifically concerned about is how the gap between those who have more and those who have less in society is very often connected to many other social problems, and so fixing it would be, in many ways, it wouldn't be a catch-all solution, it wouldn't be instant, but it would be one of the basic things that we would need to do to heal many of the bigger social problems that we have in society. So we tend to think first and foremost about that, but then also to think how income inequality, which in itself is a fairly dry and abstract subject and something which actually many people find quite difficult to even picture, let alone kind of get kind of motivated by, is nonetheless really closely connected to lots of everyday issues which people are very strongly motivated by. So in our campaigning work, we tend to think, right, okay, let's not talk about numbers, let's not talk about wages or taxes or stuff like that. Let's talk about things like housing, because housing is an issue which is in many ways very closely related to the distribution of wealth and how that's concentrated in some hands rather than others. But it is also obviously an everyday aspect of people's lives, something that we live in and around and experience and think that we know about. Now, the reason that housing is an inequality issue is probably obvious. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why you might say that it is. Some of that is to do with the way in which the property market works and the fact that housing is very expensive to buy. Some of it is to do with the way in which that has displaced lots of people into a rental market which itself is full of inequalities and can be quite exploitative. Some of it is to do with the way that our stock of social housing, affordable housing, has tended to dwindle ever since, over the last 4 decades or so. And if you add all those things together, you have what could be described as a kind of crisis, where the assumption that everybody gets a decent home in a modern, developed country like ours may not be quite as reliable any longer. And the idea that everybody, regardless of their background, has access to a decent home is looking increasingly rash as an assumption, right? Now, people often say that if you really want to see housing inequality, you should go to places like London, where Lisa lives, and she can tell you lots of stories about the sheer gap between those who have the most and those who have least in London. But of course, we experience it everywhere we go. So in a place like Swansea, there are big gaps in people's access to reliable, secure, decent living conditions. So if we're painting this as a kind of urgent picture, it's not just because we want to get bums on seats and make a bit of drama out of it. It's because we really do think that if you're thinking about the effects of inequality, housing is a major cause for concern. It's a place that you would look to, find out the kind of grim details of some of those effects and hopefully get something of a sense of what we should do about it. So I probably didn't say who I am because I always forget to say this. I'm Gideon Calder. I'm from Swansea University. I'm also from the South Wales Equality Group. There are some of our details. If you feel minded to tweet, all of these people are on Twitter, and that's the imaginative hashtag I came up with this afternoon. It's a bit long, but once you get into it, it will be all right. The way this will run is that we will have a series of contributions from our speakers, and then we will open it up for what I hope will be a fairly relaxed discussion. We've got this microphone. We're somehow going to kind of ping that around the room, depending on who's speaking at any one time, but we only have one, so we'll just have to kind of somehow ensure a smooth flow of mic'd upness around the room. So the order in which people are going to speak, I will introduce them to you. We're going to have Tamsin Stirling, a very well-known housing activist and researcher who's been an advisor to government, and in Wales terms is one of the people who spent longest thinking most about housing, particularly in Wales, as an issue. She's going to speak first and give us a kind of general picture about some kind of, big picture issues. Then we're going to have John Puzey, who's the director of Shelter Cymru, a charity which you will be well aware of, whose main concern is homes and people's access to them. And then we're going to have Lisa McKenzie from the London School of Economics, who's also kind of well-known writer, blogger, activist around amongst other things, housing issues. They're each going to talk for 7 or 8 minutes, and then we're just going to open things up. It'll be my job to somehow tell you when you've got a minute to go or something, and then forcibly stop you from speaking. We'll see how that goes. So that's the way things are going to run. We absolutely encourage people to dive in, ask questions at the end. I'll be chairing that. I'll try and keep a note of who wants to speak. We'll try and keep things informal, but critical and lively. We will stop at absolutely at 8:30 because John has to pick somebody up at the station, and we'll probably get kicked out of the room. That's the way the evening is going to go. I look forward to hearing all of your voices, and first of all, I will hand you over to Tamsin.
Thanks, Gideon. Are you okay with that? You're not using the mic, so people hear me. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry. I'm a bit sticky on the I've got a cold. So, and my voice might just go lower and lower and lower. So there we go. So I'm going to, what I want to say is on the 3 headings. So housing inequality. Firstly, what does it look like? And just some thoughts on that. Secondly, why does it matter? And then something less on what might we do about it. So what does housing inequality look like? I think of the different dimensions of that. So first at the individual level, first thing that occurs to me is street homelessness. So you've got evidence of street homelessness to individuals with large property portfolios. That's really thing. Some folk without any homes at all, others with many homes that they are then making money from either in a rental way or an investment way or both. You've also got the issue which has emerged in the news in the last couple of weeks, even in Wales, of the sex for rent. So people not being able to afford to rent anywhere and being offered accommodation for very low amounts of money, but being required to pay in other ways, shall we say. So that feels like a pretty unequal thing. You've got housing inequality as it relates to place. So I was looking on the internet, what's the street in the UK with the lowest property values? And a couple of years ago, it was in the Rhondda, and the average property value in, I think it's Ferndale, one of the streets in Ferndale was 26,000, something like that. And then there was a piece in, I think it was the Times or the FT, the street with the highest average property value is a street in Belgravia where the average property price comes in at a mean 16 million. So that's pretty unequal. It's more likely to be empty because it's an investment vehicle rather than a home. So that's another issue of housing equality. I think, is it a home or is it housing? Is it an investment vehicle? Is it somebody's asset rather than a home? I think there's issues around housing inequality as it relates to age. We're seeing a very big shift in, we've been used in the tenure profile, or the tenure that different age folk are able to access. So historically we've had rising levels of owner occupation. That's now changing. It's decreasing, but it's decreasing really, really rapidly for younger age groups who are renting often not by choice and often renting pretty poor quality at high prices, so the chance of ever being able to purchase a house, given our obsession with owner occupation, is very limited. You've got inequality in terms of quality of housing, from utter squalor through to unimaginable luxury, like on both ends of the scale, kind of really hard to comprehend. I think there was a case in London where a landlord was prosecuted because there were 37 people living in a 3-bedroom terrace house, like wall-to-wall mattresses in every room, total exploitation of, and actually I think even some were like, some people were sleeping on a mattress in the day and others at night, because people were working different shifts, through to people who've got 55 bedrooms, or even houses, 55 bedrooms that are empty. You've got inequality in terms of cost. Massive inequality in terms of cost of accessing housing. But I think one of the concerning issues there for a lot of folk is the amount people paying for that housing is an increasing proportion of their income, whether that's earned income from welfare support or a combination of both. And then you've got inequality around tenure. Let's say our preferred tenure, if you like, or the property owning democracy, as a guy called Dalton calls it. It's been owner occupation, and increasingly in the last couple of decades, there's been a real stigma around renting and particularly around social renting and council housing. And you see, I mean, you only have to look at the TV listings, for the delightful way that council housing and social housing is portrayed in the media. So there's an inequality there, albeit that for a lot of owner occupiers in many areas in the UK, their home actually can be a liability, not an asset, because they've got very low income and they can't afford to keep their home in good repair. It's this whole idea of the home, you own your own home and it's an automatic asset, does not apply across the piece. So lots of elements of inequality there. So why does it matter? Well, it matters at an individual level because people can't afford to have a decent place to live. Some people are living in squalor. Some people can't move to where they might be able to have a better paid job or have some kind of job. And some people have lack of housing causes abject misery for them. There's a huge issue, an increasing issue about intergenerational wealth. Both Shelter and the Resolution Foundation have done work on this. So you've got transfers of wealth between generations in families that are largely home owning in high property value areas, which are go beyond any way that you could save that amount of money. So with what's been happening with inheritance tax thresholds, it's kind of compounding that. And there's a bit of a thing that was built in around assuming that people have an asset on which they can borrow or pay for care or what have you. Well, that obviously only works if you have that kind of asset. But increasingly, you've got families, say home-owning families, where the transfer of wealth can pay off student debt. It can enable the next generation to get on the housing ladder, lovely term, and then families where none of the above can take place. I think it matters at a societal level. What kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to see increasing numbers of folk sleeping in cardboard shop doorways, people living in squalid conditions, while others have amazing amounts of luxury? And then there's the whole set agenda with which the Equality Trust kind of set out, started really the Wilson and Pickett spoke the spirit level in terms of that increasing inequality and what that actually generates, what it's correlated with in society in terms of, I suppose, overall ill health of society, broadly defined. And economically, massive housing inequality is no great shakes either. If people can't move to take up employment, or they're spending a huge amount of their time commuting, not as productive in work, the greater proportion of income spent on housing, people have got less to, we're all about little consumers, they've got less money to spend on things. So there's housing inequality as it relates to access to housing, experience of housing, and in terms of the asset and wealth that housing brings for some. So what can we do about it? I suppose my thoughts can get split into two bits on this. We can put more housing into the existing system, if you like, across all tenures as a call for more housing. We've had the UK government talking about 300,000 homes a year. Not quite sure how. Well, I'm not at all sure how they're going to achieve that across all tenures. But I think there's a particular need for a massive increase in social council housing at social rents, not at the rents that come to be called affordable and aren't affordable to any people. But I think that you've still got, even if you do that, you've still got bits of a system that really are still going to drive inequality. So there's do we change one or more aspects of the system? And there's some, do you get radical amount of taxation? Should you be taxing the increase in value of properties that comes from people not having done anything to their property at all other than have it for a year or whatever? So if your property goes up, should we look at taxing that? Should we look at the way we treat land totally differently? And might we look at different ownership structures, more cooperative and co-housing structures, for instance? And I think there's a lot of political, particularly around taxation of land, there's a lot of vested interests that stop those debates getting very far, I think. Is housing inequality the greatest challenge we've got? I'm not sure it's the greatest challenge, but I think the way it interfaces with other aspects of inequality around incomes and life experience means it's a really it is a crisis. I would say it does constitute a crisis, and one that we should really get serious about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much indeed, Tamsin. I'm going to ask John that you do use the microphone for the benefit of the video.
Oh, right, that's right.
Only know what you're saying.
I'm shattered the microphone, which is why I was talking about Tamsin. Yeah, I was training running, I can hit the button. Anyway, so you can hear me. Thank you. Once I die, everybody, good evening. John Puzey, Shelter Cymru. Just want to say very quickly about Shelter Cymru. We are an independent Welsh organisation. We're not a part of Shelter. We were born out of the Shelter family about 40 years ago, but for well over 30 years we've been independent of Shelter. We get on really well with them, but we are totally independent. So if you ever feel like donating to a charity and know the money will stay in Wales, addressing Wales, no, I don't. I'm going to briefly talk about. Sorry, and I normally stand up when I speak, but I brought the wrong glasses, and if I stand up, I won't be able to see my notes. I'll be too far away from them. I want to talk about how housing inequality also creates inequality in the health and well-being of people. Inequality in wealth and income clearly leads to a narrowing of people's housing choices. Well, I mean, narrowing. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people have got no choice at all. And for some, what they get is absolutely nothing. In Wales, for example, last year compared to the year before, over a particular recent year compared to the year before, there was a 57% increase in the number of people going to local authorities in Wales as homeless. And we know that won't be the full picture, but huge increase in the number of people facing or experiencing homelessness. But I guess most people find somewhere, whether it's living with friends, relatives, moving around a bit, or perhaps because of the growth of the private rented sector, going into the private rented sector, reluctant tenants perhaps, people who don't really want to go in the private rented sector, but there isn't much choice because they can't afford to get as on the housing ladder. I agree, it's very strange. And there's clearly not enough social housing to meet demand from people. But how much is that costing them relative to their income? What is the physical conditions like? How secure is their tenure? And what impact does all those things have on people's lives? I think it's, I mean, I'm sure you all recognise this, but I think people's relationship with their homes is a particularly intimate and personal one. I think people like for their homes to reflect their personality. So not having a home, or living in a home you don't like, or living in a home that's actually dangerous for your health or insecure, is a real issue, I think, for many people. And it just shows that housing deprivation is a particularly destructive one because it is so connected with how you feel about yourself, where you live. We know about, of course, the physical health impacts of living in poor housing. I mean, it's 200 years of that kind of information. Chadwick, Dickens was writing about it, so there's no excuse about us not knowing. And yet, there are many people wheezing with respiratory problems, children with asthma, older people falling, breaking their hips, and maybe never being able to live independently again. And of course, in Wales, we have some of the dampest and oldest and poorest housing in Britain, and we also have some of the highest rates of childhood asthma and a disproportionate rate of accidents through falling. So it's not surprising that these things clearly fit together. But it's those other impacts, I think, on emotional health and well-being, I think we need to recognise. Child psychologists, I'm told, when they're talking to children, in order to try and get some insight into their emotional state and into their family emotional state, often ask those kids to draw a home. Draw your home, they will say. So, you know, what kind of home will they see? Will they see a nice little house with curling smoke in? Or what do they see? And what do kids who are living in emergency accommodation or refugees draw when they're asked that? And how does that affect a child's future life and the choices or not the choices they may have? I guess what I'm saying is this is an inequality that actually cuts to the core of people's lives and expectations and their opportunities and their physical and emotional health and their ability to take part in society and be full citizens. As I said earlier, the private rented sector has grown and filled the gap in many people's lives, and the profile of people living in the private rented sector has changed as well. There's about nearly 120,000 children living in the private rented sector now in Wales. It is, as I said earlier, the poorest sector as a whole, the worst conditions, the most insecure, over 40% of households in the private rented sector are living on month-to-month tenancies, so they don't know from one month to another whether they're going to actually be evicted from that tenancy. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm example number one. Evidence, I was born and brought up in the private rented sector in the very early 50s. It was pretty crap, I have to say. It was pretty poor accommodation. And we were in a street with lots of other working class. So oddly enough, the profile we're looking at now in terms of children and families is going back to how it was in the 50s. There was some security in the 50s. There was a fair rent in the 50s, but the conditions were still pretty poor. The house I was brought up in my early years was infested. It had mold. It was cold. It was drafty. I copped mastoid infection. Had major operations. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm just a case study. I lost the hearing in my right ear. You know, this is about poor conditions and the impacts it can have on people's lives. So there we are. I've laid my heart on the table here. I just want to talk about continuing about conditions and the conditions that people live in. With our sister organisation, Shelter, a year or so ago, we developed an idea called a living home standard. And the idea of the living home standard is it's something like living wage. It's about minimum expectations of the 21st century of what a decent home should look like. The important thing about the living home standard is, as far as possible, we try not to make it the professional's idea of what a home should be like. It was a lot of work talking to people across the country, having meetings with people, inviting people into a kind of pod thing at events, trying to get people's views of what they thought was decent, appropriate housing in the 21st century. And people's expectations were not extravagant at all. And I just want to give you a couple of examples, because then I'm going to tell you what the numbers against that are. So when people were asked about affordability, the essential attribute that was finally condensed from all the conversations we had across Britain was, can meet the rent or mortgage payments on the home without regularly having to cut spending on household essentials like food or heating. It's pretty minimal stuff, isn't it? I mean, it's not an exact, they're not asking for the moon here. Not worried that rent or mortgage payments could rise to a level that would be difficult to pay. When in conditions, the home can be heated safely and effectively. Well, fair enough. The home is hot and cold running water, not too extravagant. Okay, so after that, Ipsos Mori did a poll of people, they did it in Wales, and asked people, how do you compare against this standard, this very minimum standard? 44% of people in Wales not reaching the standard overall, that minimum standard. 51% of households were households with children. 2 out of 5 social housing not meeting the affordability standard. 1 out of 3 not meeting the stability standard, that's about security. 1 in 3 poor conditions. 1 in 5 living in damp or mouldy conditions. 2 in 5 at least 1 serious life-threatening hazard. It's a pretty bleak picture, I have to say. And I think the issue is, I'm winding up now, I'm getting kind of feelings. I think the issue is really that the voice of people actually experiencing these problems, living in poor conditions, experiencing or facing homelessness, are not at the table. People are powerless and they're not being heard directly. My organisation tries to facilitate people who have had poor housing experiences or homelessness. Our job is to try and simply provide a platform, get out of the way and let them tell the story, because the story is very powerful. And we try and get them in front of politicians, and it is very powerful. You just have to be careful it's not a bit tokenistic from the politician side. But nevertheless, I think that's really important. It's important also to remember there's good intent in Wales. We have made good changes to legislation, policy and practice in Wales, but we've got a huge journey to go. We've got to make up for the shortfall of affordable homes, as Tamsin said, and indeed address the whole issue of what affordable is. It is a key thing, because it just trips off the tongue, doesn't it, without actually examining what the issue is. And we've got to understand the wider impacts on people that create inequality. But the problem we have is that everything we do is against the background, or should I say the context, of a dysfunctional housing market. I said it this morning, apologies to Tamsin, we were both at something, I'm going to say the same thing again. When I say dysfunctional, I mean it is functional for people who are doing well, but it's not functional for those people who are struggling. And changing that context, the market, is going to be a massive challenge. And we feel, my organisation feels, this is about developing a movement of people for change. And what we're trying to do is get people together, people who have experienced housing problems, but also people who haven't experienced housing problems, try and get a movement of people working in their communities, raising the issues, getting more people upset, angry and passionate about it, building also solidarity between people who have and those who have not got homes. And we feel that is one of the ways that perhaps in the end we can get real change, that paradigm shift in thinking about the importance of housing and the importance of investing in housing and the importance of changing that dysfunctional market forever. That's going to be tough though. But if you want to join, then go to our website. There's a button there where you can press and you can join us. It's right next to the donation one, actually. Thank you.
Speaking that. Okay. I suppose taking into account what both other speakers have said, because what they've done tonight is really outlined very well what's happening in the market, in the housing market. But I think what I would like to do, because there's no point me repeating this, the housing situation is dire. And I would argue that it's actually the biggest problem that we have in the UK. It is absolutely the biggest. It's bigger than Brexit. It's more damaging than it's more damaging than the problems that we've got with the NHS. And there's a reason why I say that, because without a home, you cannot build anything else. You cannot build mental health, you cannot build your physical health, you cannot build on any skills at all, you can't get a permanent job. There is nothing without a home. There is nothing. You have to have basic shelter. So at the bottom of everything, you've got to have shelter. So for me, housing is the most important issue that we face. And I think what we've got to do, I think you just mentioned that, there's a dysfunctional housing market for some. Well, it's just dysfunctional. I mean, if we have got, and we've got thousands of people sleeping in tents all over our cities, then the whole thing is dysfunctional. It's not. There's not a dysfunction at the bottom. It's actually the whole thing is dysfunctional. So I think we have to. But I'm really sad to say that we've got to make the argument for that because, we sat in a room tonight. Some chairs are empty, so some people, don't think this is an issue enough to come out on a night. But also, there are many people that don't actually see this as a actual real problem. And so what we've got to do really is start at the bottom with a basic argument, and this is our basic we've got to get, is that every single person deserves to live in a home. It's a human right. It is exactly like the arguments that we'd make for the NHS. So, we'd fight tooth and nail to stop the NHS being privatised. But actually what we've allowed to happen is council housing to disappear. And it's not an accident that, the market's working at the top okay, and, we've got all this, we've got all these houses that are owned by private landlords. There is a problem at the bottom. The problem at the bottom is because council housing has been allowed to be sold off. And it is a social good. Council housing is exactly the same as the NHS. It's about having a home. You've got a human right, and it's provided by the state or helped by the state for everybody. So everybody should have a right to a home. That's what council housing was always about. It was about having the right to a home for everybody. Now that has changed. But not only is the physical demand, not only the houses disappeared, but also the arguments around housing for everybody has disappeared as well. And what housing has become, it's become an asset. It's not a home anymore, it's about assets. And some people, and I've had this argument all week here in Wales actually, since Monday, that your personal failure is your failure alone. And we've sort of moved away from this sort of collectivity. And this is why, I suppose what I want to add here is that this is not about housing. This is about a collective failure of a whole country, of an whole idea of who we are, to care for each other. And we think now that your success is your success alone, but your failure is equally your failure alone. So the structural, the institutional and the systematic has been removed from all our, and the political has been removed from all our debate. Housing, or the lack of, or the reduction in who deserves to live in a home, is a political decision. It's structural and it's institutional. That now, in order to have a home, you must prove all sorts of things about your character, your worth, your value, and your life. If you can't prove those things, then your access to even the basic home is not equal to others. I'm having this argument too often about the intentionally homeless. And this is language that we have not heard for 40 years, really, for 45 years. Since Cathy come home and social workers took a woman's children off the street away from her. This debate outraged people in the 1960s. But today we are exactly in the same place. I sit with women in London and actually more recently in Nottinghamshire, who are regularly, on a day-to-day basis, threatened with having their children taken into care. This now is actually, it is part of the application form for housing. If you do not accept this, you do realise that we have no duty of care to you, but we have duty of care for your children. And if you do not accept this housing or this home or wherever it might be, and I've had women in London that has been offered housing in Liverpool and actually didn't even know where Liverpool was. The mother was 19 with an 18-month-old baby and handed her keys for a flat in Liverpool, and she turned it down twice. And she asked for support, and I went with her. And if I'd not seen this, I would not believe it, actually. But she was offered these keys again in Liverpool. And she was told, and I was sat with her, that if she didn't accept this offer of a house, of a flat in Liverpool, which was a perfectly good offer, she was making herself intentionally homeless. And that means that she was putting her child at risk. And so the council they told her very clearly, we will take your child. If you sleep on the streets or if you become homeless, we will have no qualms about taking your child. And this is a threat that is happening on a daily basis. There's a group in London called Focus E15. They're a group of young mums. And actually, when they started this group, they were very young. They were all under the age of 20. And actually, next weekend, they are trying to highlight the amount of children that are at risk from social services. That actually the risk is of social services removing them from their families and putting them into care because they are refusing to be moved to places that they don't want to go. So I think this term intentionally homeless needs to go, and we've got to question that. Because I'm not sure that anybody makes themselves intentionally homeless, but we've got to actually argue this basic idea that a home, everybody should have a home, that it's a human right, it's not up for discussion. And I suppose one of the things that I would like to talk about really is the way that happens. I get very tired, very, very tired, and I've been doing this. I've been working with extremely vulnerable people in London now for 5 years. And I've sat and listened to every single political party in a bingo almost. I'm going to build 50,000. It's very bravo and macho. How many are you building? I'm building 1 million. I'm building 5 million. I'm building an island full of social housing. And you know what? None of it comes to anything. It's actually pointless. I'm not sure whether we need to be building thousands and thousands of properties, actually. I know that there are 200,000 empty properties in the UK right now. That is empty properties that no one lives in. No one has lived in them for at least 6 months and up to 10 years. So there's 200,000 empty properties. But these properties are in private hands. And if there's one thing that we cannot touch, is private property. And this is why we have to make the basic argument that this is why I have to keep coming back to this basic argument about a home. A home and property are different things. And if we make the basic argument that everybody deserves a home and everybody should have a home, then it would make it easier to start to challenge private property and what that means. But unfortunately, we're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near that debate at all. So, we can lobby governments and we can lobby politicians and we can ask them to build 5 million homes and we can ask them to allow people to live somewhere where the hot water doesn't scald their children. And we can ask for these crumbs off the table if we want, and we won't get them. We'll get something totally not adequate. Or what we need to do is make that bigger argument that a home is a human right. And actually, empty properties and empty property, in particular empty homes, is actually a theft from those that need a home. It is theft. So we've got this idea that, am I a old Marxist telling you that property is theft? I probably am, yeah. And I'd never actually call myself a Marxist. But in terms of where we are now with housing, politically, we've got to make that argument that if we have empty homes standing and we have people sleeping on the streets and we have, I think there's 300,000 children that don't have a permanent home. Is it 300,000? Yeah. In the UK, we've got 300,000 children that are now classed as homeless. And if we have got empty properties, empty homes, then that surely has got to be theft from the poor, hasn't it? And I think we've got to make that political argument. We can, like I said, we can ask for some social housing and we can ask for better, lower rents, and we can ask for some, we can ask for this. But actually, it's not going to solve where we are, because where we are is fundamentally a structural, political, and institutional issue. And my experience here is that none of the political parties are willing or even able to deal with it. They are not. No one is prepared to start requisitioning empty properties. Jeremy Corbyn said last week that when he gets into government, he is definitely going to make sure that local councils can take back control of empty properties. But they can already do that. I don't know why he doesn't know this, because local governments can do this. They already can do this. So, again, so this actually tells me that none of these politicians are actually serious about this, because we don't need any new laws to do this, because we can already do it. It's just that no local government actually wants to touch private property. And so I think I'd just like to throw that argument in, really, is what this debate politically, socially, and institutionally and structurally is about.
Thank you very much. Lisa, and again to our other two speakers, there's two bits of factual information which struck me as people were speaking. One, which I picked up today, one is that the stock of housing for social rent in England has gone down by 150,000 in the last 5 years, according to a report today from the Chartered Institute for Housing. And the other is that there are 1,020 or something empty properties in Cardiff. 26,000 gross wealth.
Yeah, because they usually don't count commercial in it as well. So it becomes even extra work. If you think about the amount of empty shops that we do on our high street, none of that, no.
That's not in those numbers.
That's not even.
Yeah. Okay, on that cheerful note, let's open this up. I think this is going to involve me wandering around with a microphone, but for me to do this, I need to have people with their fingers in the air. I'll try and squeeze everybody in. So does anybody want to ask anything or say anything or respond to anything which our speakers have said? I'm coming to you. If you could say who you are, that might be good.
Hi, my name's Leonie Ramont, and I'm, amongst other things, here as a member of a non-housing co-op and as a fellowship counsel for the RSA. My question is to do with if we were to do things differently, we need different legislation, different policy. So, for instance, coming as a newcomer to Swansea, I see a lot of very beautiful buildings that I could easily see groups of people buying, either under the umbrella of a community land trust, completely not-for-profit, or as little for-profit, getting a foot on the property market. So people having shares in the house with conscious contracts that determine what their rights and responsibilities are. But for them to do that, they've got to have, they've got to be able to get insurance, they've got to be able to get a mortgage, there's got to be frameworks in place that allow them to do that. There's got to be frameworks in place that allow groups of people to do up warehouses, either as short-term housing or as longer-term housing. So it's to my mind, it seems that we need to get very good at linking people up, so that because there are resources around, there is a lot of possibilities. If local people start realizing that they can invest their pensions in their local community, then that could be going into a community land trust that's providing affordable housing, for instance. But all of these things need real joined-up thinking, I would have thought. Anyway, I'm just wondering, whether you have seen any models that are achieving this, and whether you have any recommendations for how we might move forward in a joined-up way, or start putting the pieces of the jigsaw together so that we do come up with, I'm a grassroots activist, with grassroots ways forward.
I'm coming back with a microphone to whoever wants it.
I'll just sort of throw it before. I mean, I'm always suspicious about these sort of new ideas, that we always need these new ideas. We need something new. But actually, we in the UK, we've had this before. We've done it. And it was called council housing. And that was shared ownership of property, because local councils didn't own them. We all did. Unfortunately, local government, local councils are now selling those off. We had the right to buy in 79, which was about an individual policy, which got rid of a lot of council housing. But more recently, in the last few years, we've got this sort of local government sell-off, and they're actually selling off whole council estates. In London, there is 210 council estates that is going to be demolished in the next year. No, none of those is going to be built back. They are just going to be demolished. So I'm not sure we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we've just got to make the argument that shared ownership, whether it's local government or local community, is the only real way that we can ever tackle any of this. And it's got to be, in my opinion, not for profit. Because I think once you put profit into housing, once you put profit into homes, you get property. And I think that's the problem.
And I think there's actually some of the we've got a lot of the frameworks. It's just, and there's a lot, and there's some activity in terms of there's a cooperative housing programme that is supported by Welsh Government. So different tenures. There's emerging co-ops for leasehold, for shared ownership, for ownership for rent. It's just none of it's very big scale, and I think we are not always very good at communicating, so to let people know this is possible, this is happening in one community. It could happen in your. There's a group of folk, for instance, with learning disabilities in North Wales that are looking at a housing co-op and a social care co-op to meet their housing and support needs. There's little examples. It's community land trust activity, etc. But they aren't to scale. And I don't think we're good at publicising the awareness of those and what people can do if they, if a group of 10, 12 people come together, can do things. There's community share possibilities. There's linking it up with community energy project. There's a lot that can be done in a small scale, bottom up way. And I think I'm not sure there's anything big that really needs to change legislation wise. I think it's about using what we've got and some leadership which actually doesn't go, oh, that's something different. We're not, we'll pass the planning permission for the Barrett's estate, but that 12 home cooperative scheme looks a bit different, and I think so. I do think there's a leadership issue as well.
Just very very briefly, of course, we are ending right to buy in Wales, so that's one thing anyway. Well, I think you're absolutely right about communicating the concept of shared ownership and cooperative. I was sitting at some table years ago where with Welsh Government people talking about we're very keen on developing shared ownership cooperative schemes of various sites across Wales. But what I was hearing all the time was, but people are very nervous, don't understand them, so we don't think people will really go for them. I think the issue is it's not just about communicating it's possible, it's communicating the benefits of that kind of shared approach. The fact you're sharing your risk, that actually it's almost certainly a better way than just buying somewhere yourself and ending up lumber with sorting the roof out when you're old. So it's about communicating what you can do in a cooperative and shared ownership issue that's right. And it is very small scale. I agree with Tamsin. We do need to do more about that.
Deliver it up the back of the room.
Thank you. Andrea Lewis, Cabinet Member for Housing with Swansea Council. You're absolutely right. The right to buy did deplete our stock. Fortunately, we've suspended the right to buy before the whole policy came in to get rid of right to buy. We used to have over 17,000 properties in Swansea. We now have 13,500. We have approximately 4,000 people on the waiting list, and 2,000 of those are new to us, new tenants. So it doesn't take much of a mathematician to work out if we didn't have right to buy, we could probably house the people on the waiting list. We do have a houses to homes. We have an initiative where we contact private owners of empty properties. We give them between, it used to be 5,000, we now give them a grant of 7,500 to incentivize them to bring their property back into use as a home. And we also say to them, if you take the grant and if you bring your property back into use, we will give you a tenant for 48 months. So there's an incentive to have rent then. We brought 350 plus properties back into use just last year. So the scheme is working well. I'm not going to deny that there are still empty properties. There are the challenges when, I'm generalizing here, but it seems often people inherit properties and the siblings tend to have a fallout and the property just falls into disrepair and they don't want to agree to sell it, they don't want to agree to rent it, and it is a problem, it is a hurdle. We are looking at our housing revenue account owned land and our general fund land as a council to build more. I'd be interested to ask the panel, as a council, we're looking at mixed tenure developments and pepper potting the council housing throughout those developments. And I'd be interested to hear what the panel's views are on that, because I'm getting the sense that you're very pro council housing and council housing estates. I grew up on a council estate. I had a far better experience than yourself, I'm pleased to say. Yeah, and it was, you know, it certainly was an upbringing that I'm proud of. I made a lot of friends. There was a real community spirit. If we're going back to the 1950s where you could leave your door unlocked and open, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But I take the point that there is a crisis. We have an ever-increasing ageing population. We have also the barbell effect then in Swansea, certainly, where we've got a huge influx of younger generation, a huge ageing population, and the smaller squeezed middle. So housing is a challenge, and we continue to strive to meet that challenge. We're a Labour-led administration, and I'm proud to say that housing is a top priority and a focus. In terms of bringing our housing up to a good standard, we are trying to meet the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. So we're investing 50 million in the next financial year and 157 million in the following 3 years. That will be kitchens, bathrooms, enveloping, improving the energy efficiency of the properties for the tenants. So we are trying to improve the condition of the housing, and we try and meet the ever-increasing demand. I take the point about tackling homelessness, lack of local connection, priority need. All these things are things that I think we need to look at and ensure that we're getting it right. Unfortunately, I think because there's such an influx of people needing to be housed, there needs to be a system, because there isn't enough housing to house all the people. So we need to find a way of prioritising it, and it's certainly not a task that I envy anybody, trying to decide who warrants to be housed and who doesn't. And it is a difficult thing to do. But I just wanted to assure the panel that there's certainly political appetite. I appreciate you may have heard it over and over from politicians, but I can only speak from a local government perspective in Swansea, and as I say, it's a high priority for us. Well, actually, the council estates that we've now got, you would argue we've got market sale housing pepper potted through those right now. There is definitely an inequality, if you like, across Swansea. We've got a serious lack of affordable housing in Gower and the West, and some refer to it as seas of social housing in the East. So there is a definite divide in the city, and to try and equal the city and make it more equal, I think we should try and meet the demand for affordable housing in the other two constituencies. Pepper potting, the rationale, and this is why I'm interested in your views on this. The rationale has always been that you pepper pot affordable housing or social housing throughout an estate, and it gives a better quality of life to the people on that estate. I'm not convinced, and I'd be very interested in your views on that.
Is everybody clear what pepper potting means? I take it that you are.
Yes, I'm not sure about pepper potting. I mean, I know what it means, but I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So I'm going back again in time. It was one of those days when Nye Bevin was responsible for the National Health Service, was also responsible for housing in Britain, and he had a vision of housing, of social housing, we call it now. We would just say council housing, wouldn't he? Where you had a mixed community, for want of a better term, where you had the lawyer and the miner and the nurse, all living down the same street, and that kind of the idea of that kind of stable type of community. Now, in a sense, I think. Well, I think pepper potting is attempting to do that, isn't it? It's attempting to kind of mix those kind of, for want of a better word, professions, backgrounds together in the idea of creating this kind of more stable community. Where there's stuff about getting a better ratio of adults to children and stuff like that, isn't there? I think I probably, I don't know, I'm not going to speak for Lisa, but I wish it was social housing. It was actually having that mixed group of people rather than the necessity of that. But you've got pepper potting anyway. I think that's what you're saying, is it? Because you've sold houses, so it's how you make the best of that, I guess. So.
Houses for market sale, we can reinvest that money back into building more homes.
Well, that's dangerous. That's dangerous. I'm watching it. I've been watching very closely local governments turning into property developers. That is going, for me, that's well going down the wrong route, because what you're doing with that is you're accepting the market conditions as they are, and you're not challenging it at all. And that's why I asked you what the rationale with pepper potting is, because here in Wales, you may be able to get away with it, because if you don't have any right to buy, it means that the housing in that community will stay as council housing. But so it's that part, because in St Anne's, where I'm from, in Nottingham, they did that, and all that happened. They put private housing in the middle of the council estate, and all that happened was right to buy landlords bought them, and then they got rented out to people that wanted to live in St Anne's in a council house but couldn't get one. So it just didn't work, and I've not heard of any of this that ever works. But there's another reason about the pepper potting, and that's if you are accepting the logic and the market as it is, and that somehow that for working class people in this country there's something wrong with them. They've not succeeded enough to get on the housing ladder, and if you put them all together they'll be a nuisance and a menace. So therefore, if we split them up, I was at school when they used to split me up from everybody, and they used to, and the reason they used to do that is because if they thought me and my mates were together, they thought we would cause a problem. And so when I hear the pepper potting stuff, that's what I hear, because I've watched it the other way round, where they put private housing in the middle of a council estate, and all that happens is it goes to buy-to-let landlords. So when I hear it now, it appears that what it means is you put council housing in the middle of a private estate and hope it raises the aspirations of the working class. Whereas I would argue that council housing used to be universal, it used to be for everybody, and it should be again. And I am not somebody that thinks, I remember Bob Crow lived in a council house till he died. And I remember the right-wing press absolutely slating him, going, a man who's on 60 grand a year and he's living in a council house, how dare he? But that only, that's the rationale of a the market that doesn't work, where it's rare and, it's some sort of prize to have a home. I'm talking about changing the old ideology around homes that we've all got, that everybody's got one. It's not rare, it's not precious, it's actually something that we're all entitled to. Yeah, it's a it's a normal thing to not, to be homeless is not normal. That's what I want to change it. And I think when you start, and especially for councils that are now putting their toes into private property developing, that for me is absolutely not. That is where, I live in London now. That's where you end up. You end up with developments that are that your rent is means tested. That councils want higher income tenants in because they can pay more money. And so for me, that's not challenging it at all.
Just an interesting reflection on the pepper potting issue. Back in the day, so late 80s, early 90s, I worked for a housing association, and there was an injection of money. I can't remember which year it was. There was a couple of financial years when, and I think it was called existing satisfactories. Delightful words we used to describe homes. So there was money came to housing associations to buy houses on existing estates, and they're quite often new estates, and part of it was because there was a slump in the housing market, and it's sort of a bit like Help to Buy at the moment, but not quite, so it was about making sure that private developers didn't lose too much money and all that sort of stuff. So and I worked for a reasonably big size housing association in Cardiff, and we buzzed out, and our development folk bought all these different properties, and we housed people, and they loved it, and it was this, and it's fine. The number of complaints we got from neighbours, the owner occupying neighbours, it was a nightmare. Immediate stigma for the people who are renting from the housing association as social tenants. So it doesn't just I was a bit of an idealist about it. I thought, great, mix the tenures in. That's how it should be. We should all just be able to live side by side. But actually, I it's really some really difficult housing management stuff from the So this real thing of, well, we've saved up to buy a place on this estate, and they've got it for nothing, and it's so deeply ingrained, and that's, I suppose, sort of backing up what Lisa's saying, it's so deeply ingrained now. It's just, this sort of thing about deserving and undeserving, and who's worked for what, and that's just a bit of a personal experience about it was kind of the reverse. It was the housing associations buying properties to let on newish estates that have been developed by developers. Most of them have been sold, and then they couldn't. And it's an ideal opportunity for the developers to sell en masse, really, to quite a lot of properties at once to housing associations. So it's not without its problems, really. Yep.
Yes, thank you. I'm Viv Sugar. I'm chair of the Bevan Foundation, and John has just pinched my quote that I was going to use about Bevan. I'm still quite involved in housing circles, and I see a lot of innovation and creativity across Wales, which is very exciting. But the problem is that we're not very good at transferring good practice from one place to another, and a lot of the energy and focus is on small groups of people who might benefit from a particular scheme, rather than a strategic view, which is, pleased to say, evident in the case of Swansea, but not evident across every local authority in Wales. My question really to John and to Tamsin is about what more Welsh Government could be doing, accepting austerity, accepting cuts, accepting the challenges of welfare changes. If either of you could be Welsh Housing Minister for the day, what are the things what are the levers that you could press? Because my own view is that we're nowhere near ambitious enough. There isn't as much drive and urgency about the problem as there needs to be.
I think. It's interesting, isn't it, housing minister? Because I think one of the problems is housing gets stuck firmly in the housing corner, as it were. Whereas actually, if you look at, we've got a real problem in many real problems in Wales. But when you're spending over half the budget that comes to Wales, the block grant, on health, and that amount is rising every year and really starting to squeeze in a major way other budgets. I think unless you do some real
kind of challenging thinking around that. There's going to be a real limit to what you can do in terms of investing in housing. I think we should have a housing and health ministry, really, back to what it was before, so that you actually look at it in the round, and that you start thinking of decent housing for everyone as a human right, as health promotion, as health assurance, as a way of enabling a good education, not enabling a good education, but supporting good education for everyone, and making joint and doing some real joint and requiring that also to happen at it wouldn't be local authority level because there's 7 health boards, but really leading by example in terms of I know you say joined up thinking, but actually joined up decision making, allocation of resources, and a requirement that happens on the ground as well, so that you're not by rising homelessness, you're just landing more costs on health. It's crazy, and that's it. And as I say, nobody's deliberately making bad decisions, but we're not making decisions in the round, I don't think, at all. So I think housing and health ministry, and really look, really challenge ourselves about what money goes where, and a requirement for that to be joined up at regional and local level as well.
Thank you. I'd make Tamsin the housing minister. I agree with that. In fact, my organisation proposed some time ago there should be a housing and health. I thought you objected to that. Anyway. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's the key issue, how you join up, how you link. I think one of the things I would do, I go to the First Minister and say, can we reduce the number of local authorities in Wales from 22 to 8, so we can have much more strategic authorities for a start off. Can we also, I would go to the Finance Minister and say, we need to do something really bold here to raise new forms of revenue. Can we have a land value tax brought in? Because I think we probably can do that in Wales very soon under new, which will actually stop land banking, and also create new revenues which could be used for affordable local homes. So I think it is about joined up, but it is about being bold. I think you're absolutely right, Viv. There seems to be there seems to be a risk-averse feel around the Welsh Government at the moment. I would also seriously want to argue, and I'll probably be talking to the Finance Minister again about this, about exploring the devolution of housing benefit to Wales, because the problem we've got here, we can be as progressive as we like about our housing strategy in Wales, but if you don't have that key lever about the benefits that support people to pay for their rent, if you haven't got that lever, and we haven't, then you're constantly getting the carpet pulled from under you. We've seen that all the time. You're always reacting. We had to react to the bedroom tax. It wasn't our idea. It was imposed on us. We were in the process of reacting, weren't we, to the under 35 disaster. Okay, that was averted, but always trying to change our strategy to meet these disasters coming down the road from Westminster. So why not do it? Why not devolve housing benefit? Why not therefore introduce a living rent regime? Because you can do that if you control your housing benefit. You can bring in something like living wage, but living rent. Why not start reversing that money so it actually starts being invested in bricks and mortar rather than chasing higher and higher rents? I'll do that the first day.
Can I just add something there? Because what happens, I mean, this is with the question, this is what happens when you sort of ask the question, what happens here in Wales? So what happens, you've done all of this, and it's working and it's really good, and you've got no one's homeless in Wales, and it's the fair system. So people from Birmingham who are homeless go, well, I'm going to come to Wales then, because we could get housed. Because this is the problem because this is joined up but not joined up. So what happens when, we come from Nottingham and Birmingham and we go, well, the English government, they don't care about us, so can we come to Wales and will you look after us? Yeah, because this is. I've been thinking a lot about what's happening with with the nationalist ideas, and once we start getting we start thinking about, well, who are we going to look after? Are we going to look after our own? And then who becomes our own? And that's why I'm all for fighting that structural inequality rather than... So I'm going to ask you now, because you two are the minister, so what are you going to do? What are you going to do when we all come from over the border wanting your good housing?
I suppose not passports. It's interesting because that debate's already been had, hasn't it? I remember with the homeless, because we introduced progressive homelessness legislation, doesn't have all those barriers. Well, okay, but so there was a view that there'd be lots of people flowing across the border. That hasn't happened because people tend to stay in their own neighbourhoods. They want to live where they want to live, rather than sort of say, I know, I'll go to Line of Festiniog. I don't know what it is, but I'll go there because I think I might be helped with home. I don't think that's really how people operate, quite frankly. I mean, studies of rough sleepers show that the studies we've just finished, a lot of those people are actually from the nearby area. They're not sort of appearing from nowhere. They're actually local people who find themselves in these massive difficulties. So, but otherwise, I don't know what we.
It's always worth asking.
Well, yeah, I mean.
And it was definitely raised as a major issue during the Housing Wales Act, the homelessness stuff. You know, in terms of the scrutiny and political concerns, etc. And it hasn't really transpired.
This is what has been happening with the sort of local connection stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what is what the local connection stuff is about.
Yeah.
And so that's why I always try to raise that.
I think in terms of the sort of housing akin to the NHS, I think it's Will Hutton called the NHS collective insurance against brute bad luck, which I really like that. And so if you're lucky enough not to experience brute bad luck and not need much of the NHS, well, that's lucky, isn't it? You haven't had. So, I think it's that, and it's that collective sense which we've really lost in most of housing, which I think is, and this real sense that it's an asset, and it's asset that your family keeps holding. And look what's been happening with inheritance tax levels. So there's this greater sense that it's your right and entitlement to have an asset that in some areas of the country is increasing massively, far quicker than you can earn money for many people, and you can leave that to the next generation. It's a really ingrained, and it's only, if you look back the early 20th century, most people in the UK rented their home. Didn't they? It's a really recent thing that we've got into this thing about home, about asset rather than home, and so kind of you think, is it really that deeply ingrained? Can we start unpicking it?
I think we can.
Yeah.
This is I'm not hopeful about lots of things, but actually, with housing and unpicking it, and unpicking this individual sort of private property, I am quite hopeful that we can do that, because there's one thing that is totally obscene to most of us is people in tents on the street. I mean, that is obscene. That upsets me.
Thanks very much. We have another question there. I just wanted to make an observation that that kind of worry about migration into a kind of generous housing system. I mean, all of the numbers on what migration has done to the UK in general tend to suggest that people who actually come in contribute rather than being a drain. So you're not creating this kind of sink into which people kind of go and they just drain the resources away. They will come and they will do stuff, and Wales is actually often losing people to elsewhere who it could do with hanging on to. So it's not necessarily simply a kind of generous gesture. It could actually be quite a solid investment in the country. But anyway.
Homelessness by making the price of property so expensive. I see in Swansea some very good housing associations providing presumably affordable housing, but I also see that they're making a lot of money. And I can't help thinking that if the people who were living there could actually buy their house, they would have a sense of accomplishment, of ownership in the sense of I'm worth something and I belong here and this is mine. And I would argue that they would invest more in the community, that they would then kind of feel connected. Now, in a rental market, I'll just say, in a rental market where everybody's renting and they have a sense of long-term security and the rents are fair, I think you get the same effect. So I'm not saying that ownership per se is better, but in the sense just of that how do we connect, how do we belong in a place, how do we have a sense of investing in the community in a place. And so I would argue that this cycle, the average house in Swansea can be bought in 10 years through what would be a rental. And I would just like to propose that as a model, because I think that here I am sort of the devil's advocate. I would argue that council housing breeds dependence and sort of just like not really valuing because it is there, central heating, for instance, all kinds of things that come as part of what should be, people's rights, but is something that if you're buying a place, you actually takes a long time to afford. So yeah, I'm just saying we have like almost the scales, ownership, rental, but I think we could be much smarter in thinking about what the options are. And I would actually love to see the people of Mount Pleasant all owning their houses and doing community energy and doing community gardens. At the moment, everybody is living very fragmented, as in separated lives. People don't often have a sense of social capital. And I'm really interested in how we build that. So my question is, what do you think of that? What builds social capital?
Again, I actually, it's funny, I wrote a book about this. So, it's how you define social capital. It's how you define social capital. So I would argue that people who live in council housing that have got secure tenancies in secure communities have everything invested in that community. So to think that they're not invested is absolutely wrong. They have everything. They have history and they have future. And you can't get any more invested than grandparents and grandchildren. You can't. That's as invested as you get. And we did have that system that you're talking about, where everybody can own their home and it can take them 10 years to pay it off at the rent, and it's called right to buy. And we already had that. And that's what, and the reasons that we're in, some of the reasons we're in the problems that we've got today is because of that. So that actually worked again. It totally worked against community cohesion or stability. It absolutely worked against it. Our council housing here in the UK they used to have lifetime tenancies. So you could live in them for your whole life. You were never afraid that you were going to be homeless. So that meant you invested in where you lived. You invested, I know people who's had council houses and they put brand new kitchens in them. They've spent a lot of money on them, not, because it's their home. So, yeah, so there's no reason why we haven't got them. There's no, apart from the fact that we've got a scarcity in homes and the market, and nobody wants to touch the overheated housing market. They don't want to touch it. Everybody's terrified of it. Because to be honest, in the UK, the only thing that's keeping it really afloat is the fact that people think they've got capital in their house. So they don't want to touch it. But regarding social capital, people have already got, they've got loads of social capital, loads of it. They know their neighbours, they know the school, they've invested in it. It's just that type of social capital, the local social capital, is not institutional or valued by anybody that doesn't live there. So people looking in would go, why aren't they doing better? But actually, they're doing all right.
Yeah, I don't think having social capital is predicated on home ownership, and I think actually it can work in the opposite way, in that home ownership is very individualist, and there are collective forms of ownership, which I think there's some
really interesting cooperative ownership co-ops where you've got collective action around communal space, around waste, around energy, around so you can have really good collective stuff and social stuff and community stuff around ownership. It's not predicated on it, and actually I would say it's the exception rather than the rule. Great social landlords, good social landlords that listen to their communities, do loads of stuff around community food growing, about community energy, education and stuff. So there's a lot. I think there's a lot of assumptions made about different tenures and what's happening and what isn't happening. And I don't think it's helpful, personally, to sort of there's too much ownership good, renting bad. Demonisation, particularly of social renting. And I think there's a lot to be said. But yes, it has to be well managed. Yes, it has to be good leadership. All the rest of it. But there's some pretty horrendous owner-occupied estates to live on in terms of poor design, in terms of communal space not being looked after, public space, the public realm being really crappy, not being safe. So I think there's a lot more than the tenure. And I think as Lisa said, there's a lot of social capital that isn't recognised or valued because you can't put a pound sign on it. And we're really in a state of cost of everything, value of nothing kind of territory. And a lot of that relational stuff we don't value enough, and it's actually what makes places work and makes places decent places to live. And people put up with poorer quality homes if they've got good community connections.
I absolutely agree with everything. The one tenure where you can point to people being disinterested in their homes is the private rented sector, where it is insecure. It's all the opposite of what you've just been talking about. It's insecure. It's costly. Conditions are very poor. And I don't blame people in those circumstances saying, I'm not going to invest too much in this because I might not even be here in 2 or 3 months. I might just get chucked out by the landlord because I'm on a rolling monthly tenancy. But I absolutely agree. I think people living in good quality social homes where there's security and safety are absolutely, from my perspective, involved in communities and developing their own social capital, as far as I can see. Absolutely. They're good.
You were talking about growing your own food. Again, working class communities have been doing this until we got these things ripped away from us. We actually were doing them all right. So allotments, we used to feed each other. We used to constantly feed the allotment movement. They've been destroyed. So this is why I don't think we should. There's not a remaking of the wheel here. We've had things that work really well.
This is a little bit because John has to get to the train station.
Thank you. But the point isn't that those working class communities have been decimated and right to buy is. The working class now tend not to have the luxury of that community stability on the estates. And the working class now are fragmented and struggling in the private sector, because of this housing scarcity. So that's the dilemma ultimately, isn't it? And then how do we, I'm also in Swansea Council with Andrea, how do we finance, building more housing, because that's what's needed, without, if we could buy some and sell it, and then we've got some money to build some more to rent, how do we get out of this trap where there just isn't enough housing?
Said is if the borrowing cap was lifted for councils and councils could develop their own proper strategies and plans to build as much housing of the tenure mix that they felt they needed without restrictions from the Westminster government, from the Treasury, then I think that would be. But that Wales can't change that. That has to come from the wider sense of this. Housing as a human right is something we should be. And we know. There's those graphs that the UK Housing Review, don't they? We've only ever built enough housing when council housing has been in it big time. The volume house builders build about 125,000 a year. Barely, even with Help to Buy, where they've just been handed, the money's just been going down the chute to the volume housing builders through Help to Buy. It's a daft demand side policy.
they're still just building roughly that amount. So if we need 300, they're not suddenly going to build another 200,000 homes a year more. Why would they? The prices would come down. It's counterintuitive for their business model. So we're only actually ever going to build enough housing if social and particularly council housing's in it big time. And so I guess we just have to keep on and make that argument louder and louder and connect it to other things like the economy, like health, like increasing problems with the amount of money that health services costing, and a lot of that is down to poor housing, it's like doing the local but making the structural arguments at the same time, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of persistence, but we have to do it.
There's the road theory as well. Have you heard of the road theory, where because there is an argument about keep building because you can never build enough ever. So there's a road. Have you heard of the road theory? That if you've got congestion, it doesn't matter how many roads you build. All it does is increase the traffic. So there is a theory that actually regarding housing, there is something there about not always just keep building and keep building and keep building. Yeah. I mean, I live in London now, and I'm watching 50-storey towers go up in 2 years, and we all know they've got about a 20-year lifespan. So there's, I think this is a much bigger problem than just, it's not that simple. Well, it is simple actually. Build houses that with a 100-year lifespan. That's it, because we're building things what's going to last 20 years. So it's almost like we're never going to have enough, ever.
We keep stopping on these really light, cheery notes. In a moment, I think we should thank our speakers again. Before we do that, I just wanted to remind people that if they could, before they leave, make sure that they've given us their details. I wasn't joking earlier on. We really will be in touch. Our group meets roughly once a month. We have a branch in Newport and we have a branch in Swansea. They both meet roughly once a month. I can't remember whether we know when our next meeting is, but anyway, you'll get an email about it because now we have your email address. It would be great to see people there. It's not always about housing. It can be about all sorts of other things as well. There's not a huge amount of us, but we're quite committed to keeping the ball rolling with this and to getting more people on board, and we'd always welcome new members from all different directions. Thanks again for coming tonight. I think we should be very grateful to our speakers for managing to fit so many ideas and thoughts and policies and general strategies into that discussion. And thanks again to all of our questioners too for helping things stay so interesting.